scripts. All right. Welcome everybody to Microsoft Education Security Office Hours. We're going to go over today Azure Sentinel, which is our cloud SIEM and source system. Manuel's going to go over going over the free ingestion pieces. So there's some pieces that you'll pay for within Azure Sentinel. There's some pieces you won't. I figured having a session to at least kick things off from the Azure Sentinel side on what you can ingest at no cost would probably be, probably would be a good thing for people to start off with. So on that note, I'm going to hand it over to Manuel, who's a cloud solution architect in our specialist team unit living down in the South Florida area. Lucky him, he's not dealing with the rest of the cold and the snow that the rest of the world is today.
Oh my goodness. To everybody out there freezing, man, you have my sympathy and empathy. I've got some horror stories from some colleagues up in Texas. Really worry about you guys, but if you're able to join the call, hopefully you're okay and your family's okay. But Steve, I appreciate the intro, and of course, giving credit to Steve, security specialist and an all-around great guy who lets me use his tenant demo stuff because I ran out of money in one of my tenants this week, and so Steve, just before this call, gave me access to his tenant so I could show something off. But anyway, fun times, all kinds of things going on across the U.S. But let's focus on Azure Sentinel SIEM source solution and why we're talking about it. So Sentinel, we know what it is. If you're joining this call, you may have an idea. Some of you may be using it. I'll explain where it plays, right? So it's a security incident event management and a response system that's cloud-based. And if we think about this expanding digital state that we're all in the EDU space, I worked for 20 years in a higher ed institution, joined Microsoft back in 2012. So I still kind of remember, what it's like to deal with this, challenging environment. A lot of our education institutions, we think about the K-12 space, many of them, especially the larger districts, they're like small cities. They have all the logistics headaches, all the security headaches, plus students that are, participants that are children. So they have a lot of additional requirements around, compliance and security with children involved. Of course, in the higher ed space, you've got, regulatory compliance with research workloads, et cetera, that are just ever expanding, right? And so we think about that expanding digital estate, it keeps generating more and more signals that we ought to be watching. And so we think about the traditional security operations center challenges is, it's high volume of noisy alerts. The threats are getting more and more sophisticated all the time, as we saw with this recent supply chain attack, just super duper sophisticated ways to get into your environment. There are so many siloed products. I mean, let's be honest with each other, EDU is the land of point solutions, right? And there's so many different point solutions we have in our environments that it gets very difficult to secure them. A lot of times we have a lack of automation around responses. In fact, many of our customers, right, have zero automated responses. And of course, security skills are in short supply, which really what that means is security skills are in high demand, which means security skills are expensive, and it's very difficult for EDU to cope with that modality, right? And then the other thing that's amazing is the amount of infrastructure. Those of you that are running SIEM source solutions, think traditional on-premises solutions. I remember the shop I worked at, there was an entire VMware environment with separate hardware, clusters, multiple data centers, deployments dedicated to just the SIEM solution. That's a lot of time. That's a lot of IT that the security team was doing. And so we think about, how we can improve upon that modality. There's a lot of opportunity there. And this is traditional SOC challenges across any vertical, but in EDU, we add to the fact that we're probably wearing multiple hats, right? So our security folks, you got to be a wizard part of the time, and you got to have some luck in order to make things work. And that's the way it is in EDU, right? Very few of us in EDU are blessed to have an actual security operations center, a separate security team, and if so, it's probably understaffed. So a lot of times it's, multiple hat wearers trying to get this done. So how can we bring some relief? Well, maybe what we do is instead of building this stuff in infrastructure, we start to do this with cloud and do it cloud exclusive as much as possible so that we don't have to be managing hardware. We don't have to be managing query performance. We don't have to be tuning databases and LUNs to try to make our SIEM work. Instead, we just pump data into the SIEM. The SIEM is in the cloud and we don't maintain it as far as even software updates. And then, of course, by bringing it to the cloud, we have opportunities to apply artificial intelligence to the signal to help separate that wheat from chaff. Too many times, again, I'm going to say some provocative things that hopefully, if you think I'm way off, say so in the comments, or come off mute if you want to argue with me. But I think a lot of us, and I was a former CISSP. I call myself a recovering CISSP. Used to do multiple hat wear security stuff, and there were times when I would enable logging solutions that I knew full well nobody was going to look at. You would check a box for compliance by having enabled the logging, but in your heart of hearts, nobody's looking at this. It's just not possible. There's too much signal. There's not enough refinement, and so that's that's one of the things that bring in AI and cloud scale to this to refine the signal to get the wheat separated from the chaff and actually have actionable signals that we can then choose to automate is powerful. Call out some things around Sentinel and specific, limitless cloud speed and scale. I do mean limitless. I did have a customer that was talking about bringing in 25 terabytes of logs ingest per day. And, all our docs say limitless, but that specific ask caused me to go to the product team and ask, hey, dude, do you mean unlimited? And they said, yes, we mean unlimited. We're not going to bat an eyelash at your customer at 25 terabytes a day. I'm like, okay, cool. I guess you mean unlimited. So I think they mean it. The other cool thing is you can bring in a lot of signal at no cost. So Office 365 data and the Defender suite, bring that data in for free, Azure Activity Log. We'll go over some of the details. That's very powerful in my humble opinion, because unlike the traditional SIM, where you have to stand up a bunch of infrastructure, get a trial license, start to bring in some stuff and have a time limited scenario. Since Sentinel was in preview, through GA and through post GA, those ingests are free. So our customers have been able to ingest those data types without cost for free from the preview time till now. And so that is a little different than a lot of the other SIM solutions on the market. Super easy to integrate with your existing tools, and we'll show you some of those connectors, and really fast threat protection response with AI at your side. So, what we're going to concentrate here on is, talk about how it works, right? You've got a funnel. The whole idea is let's bring signal in from various sources. And of course, if you're thinking about the power of correlation and the power to see big picture, especially when you think about lateral movement attacks, you need a lot of signal. The problem is when you have a lot of signal, you got a lot of chaff and you need to separate out the wheat. That's that middle part. How do we enrich that data? And this is the power of the cloud stuff, right? That's in Azure, right? So bringing in predefined queries at Jupyter Notebooks, playbooks on the response side, super performant data repositories within Azure Monitor to be able to do queries against very high performance at very large sizes. And then of course, integration. It's great that you can generate an alert, but I'm using a service management system. So integration into your favorite ITSM solution, as well as the ability to integrate into community developed hunting notebooks and AI and ML models is super, super powerful. And that's all part of this. Now, what we're going to focus on in this discussion is in the funnel side, collection, right? Perhaps in future conversations, we can dig a little bit deeper into this enrichment side and integration side, right? But for today, we're going to talk about, man, in order to start getting any value out of this, I got to bring signal in. How can I bring signal in without breaking the bank? Let's talk about what you can do, on the free side. Obviously, we have a huge investment in security. We spend over $1 billion a year in cybersec. We have 3,500 plus global security experts, and just mondo amounts of signal coming in. Reiterating again, there's no infrastructure to set up or maintain. I'll say it again, no infrastructure to set up or maintain. The only exception would be scenarios where you have systems that you want to pull data from that are not internet connected. There may be relay agents you have to set up, right? Forwarding agents, think about like a logd forwarder for Unix systems or firewalls. That'd be the only thing that you would ever have on premises that's involved in this. And it scales automatically. There are no limits on this. And by the way, also, unlike some of the other Azure PaaS services, there's not a stamp cost, right? So when you think about like, you don't set up Sentinel Premium 2 SKU, right? And then have a stamp cost and then pay for ingest. No, it's purely on ingest. Of course, there are micrometers that turn when you send out alerts. The ITSM connector, costs a fraction of a penny. You get my point. But the main cost that you think about when you're working with Sentinel is simply the amount of data you're ingesting. And of course, the stuff that's free to ingest doesn't turn the meter. So that's very powerful. And then, of course, you only pay for what you use. You have predictable billing with capacity reservations as well. I'll show you that in a moment when we get into that. And just the ability to not have to do all this stuff. No hardware, no maintenance, no software setup. Just plug into the SIM in the cloud. That's what Sentinel offers. So let's take a look at how we integrate with some of the existing sources. This is how we're going to drive down signal quantity to cases and get that actionable. That's kind of the payoff. And I'll skip through a lot of this marketing stuff to make sure I hit you with what are the actual get started steps, right? So the steps we're going to do is you log into the Azure portal, you create an Azure Sentinel instance. You still haven't spent any money. Sentinel instances don't cost anything. You're going to connect free ingest sources. Those also don't cost anything. And then if you want to see the fine print on what is free, Manuel, you're talking about free. What exactly is free? The URL is down here at the bottom. It's the FAQ for Azure Sentinel pricing. And this is what it has in it, right? What are the free sources of ingest? Azure Activity Logs, the Office 365 audit logs, as well as the all SharePoint activity and Exchange admin activity, alerts from all the Defender suite products. So that's Azure Defender, M365 Defender, Microsoft Defender for Office 365, Defender for Identity, Defender for Endpoint. Also Azure Security Center via Defender for Azure Security Center, Cloud App Security, and Azure Information Protection. All of those can be adjusted at no additional cost into both Sentinel and the underlying Azure Monitor Log Analytics. So that's the stuff we're going to be focusing on today, is the free stuff we can plug in and not have to pay for. So what I've done in this deck, and I'm not going to go through all the slides here, is I've taken all the free ingest logs and I've taken essentially the documentation around how to connect each one of those, and I've put it on a slide for you to make it a little bit easy in case you want to talk to your colleagues about this or you want to follow along at home after the call and plug this stuff in. You got it kind of in a nice format here, talking about what the prerequisites are if there are for a specific connector, and of course a link to the docs if you want to read more about that particular connector. Okay, so I'm not going to go through each one of these. What I'll do is I'll show you in the portal what this looks like. And so as a leave behind, Steve, we'll go ahead and share this deck out, and that way you guys can have that in your back pocket. So I'll take a moment here to see if there are any questions so far. Let me come back to the free stuff.
There is the portal. Sure. There's one question from John. He said, "What about licenses for the feeds?" I'm assuming he's asking about question on, hey, do we need to be licensed for Defender for Office or Defender for? So if that's your question, yes, you need to be licensed for the individual products that, even though the ingestion is free, you still do need to be licensed for Office 365 or Microsoft Defender for Identity. So hopefully that's what your question was. If not, please come off mute, John, and go ahead and shoot your question out over the air. Thank you.
That was a question. So also with licensing, does everybody have to be licensed for it? Do we have to have that license for every student and faculty staff member? Or do we just need some of these for faculty and staff?
So Sentinel doesn't have a license. We had a huge licensing conversation 2 weeks ago that Mr. Bernetti did on how to license the individual products and the entire A5 suite from the security side of the house. But as far as ingesting the stuff into Sentinel, the user does not have to be licensed for the underlying piece. Obviously, if you want to get data out of there, and let's say like Defender for Identity, then yes, your faculty and staff has to be licensed. There's a student use benefit with it, and then you can pull that data in if that's what you want to do. Does that answer your question?
So if an account does not have a license associated with it, that data does not go into Sentinel. But if an account has licenses with it, especially if it's the Microsoft Defender for Office 365, that's what's on the slide. If we open that to any account, then all of those log files would go into Sentinel. If we say we want it ingested.
I think we're getting lost in translation here. So if you want a user to be protected by Office Defender for Office 365, then they have to be licensed. If a person is licensed and they're being protected, then that data will be available for ingest. It has nothing, so the license of Office 365, the Defender for Office 365, has nothing to do what Sentinel is going to ingest. It's going to ingest whatever you give it to ingest. If you have users that are licensed for Defender for Office 365, then there will be data for it to be ingested.
Right. So John, if we think about this, right, this is already refined signal, right, that this connector is bringing into Sentinel. And it'll make more sense as we look at the connectors, John, but we think about Defender for Office 365, right? Well, that's not like raw Office 365 activity log that the user is doing. No, this is Defender refined signal from the product Defender for Office 365, right? Which is licensed under Office 365 ATP Plan 2, right? If that makes sense, right? So when we think about it, I know it's kind of complex, but we think about Sentinel is sitting here ready to ingest signal. There are connectors to ingest signal from various sources. Whether signal emanates from that source or not can be influenced by whether the end user has a license, if that makes sense, right? For the licensed premium products.
I think I got it. Thanks.
And John, I apologize. It's not super duper clear in all the documentation. And I'll be honest with you, as was talked about during the last conversation, there are some pockets where just by having one license in the tenant, sometimes things get lit up. And so I guess, John, what I would say is if you get signal flowing in, just look at it as a benefit, right? I'm not an expert on exactly which signal sources in the suite on the Monarch Workplace side require a license for every belly button, for that belly button to generate, that belly button person's activity to generate threat data. I know that in some cases you might get extra data for free, right? That you're not supposed to get. That came up in the last conversation. Steve, I might be talking out of turn a little bit, but I do believe that came up in the last week's conversation as well.
And just a point of clarification, somebody wrote in the chat, you do need Log Analytics Workspace even for the free ingestion, right? Yes, that's correct. So there is a minimal cost with creating a workspace. So you're right, there will be, it's not 100% free, but it's not like you're going to be charged thousands of dollars for something every month. Or even $100.
Some of my Azure colleagues on the CSA side, keep me honest here, I believe Log Analytics Workspace doesn't cost anything. It's the data that rolls into it that costs. And you see here, this is ingested at no additional cost into both Sentinel and underlying monitor Log Analytics. So it really is free.
All right.
Now,
I stand corrected.
The caveat to that, right? The caveat to that is, that's great that you got signal rolling in, but what are you going to do once you get an alert, right? You're probably going to want to send it to a person. How do you send that alert to a person? And we talk about, we can get into more of the details there, but they're like, again, fractional, like hundredths or thousandths of a penny to send an email out. Plus the first, 10,000. We'll look at the FAQ, but first 10,000 might be free, right? So my point is, yes, there are micrometers around some of the alerting side. Certainly when you get an ITSM connectors, there can be, again, micro fractional of a penny meters on those, sometimes per 1,000 alerts. It might be 0.0001 pennies. But the point is, really, you can say, as an EDU customer who's very cost sensitive, you can get into Sentinel with these free ingest sources without fear of breaking the bank, right? Because again, even if you send alerts out to people, as long as you don't send recorded voice alerts to people, yeah, that's kind of expensive. But even if you send them SMS messages, a certain number are included for free, and then after that, it's a fraction of a penny, so it's not bad. I really think reasonably you can get into an experience with Sentinel with your real data without breaking the bank. But it's good to talk about this. We're talking about, where are the potential for costs, and we want to be fully transparent. We're calling out everything that might turn a meter. So let's head over to the portal and take a look at. So here's Sentinel, right? I've got Sentinel stood up, and it's as simple. By the way, if you want to deploy Azure Sentinel, it's as simple as coming, let's say the home of the Azure portal, create a resource. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and type Sentinel. All right, you got our marketing brand name. You see Sentinel there, and if I want to, I can go ahead and create Marketplace Sentinel. Why am I seeing that? Okay, sorry. Let me not do that. We got a little marketplace. discovery issue. So if I search Sentinel up the top, Sentinel Workspaces, if I don't have one, it'll tell me add one, right? And I can add a Sentinel workspace and go through the process of just creating a new Sentinel workspace, underlying Log Analytics workspace if I don't have one already. Those are just a couple clicks. You'll set them up in a region. By the way, the regionality is really just more around where do you primarily host your stuff, because most of the signal is going to be coming across the internets over TLS 1.2 encrypted HTTPS. It doesn't really matter what region you put it in. Generally, I'd say put it wherever you put most of your Azure stuff. In my scenario here, I've got this workspace that I've got set up. And the first thing we're going to do is, presuming that we don't have anything connected, is come over here to data connectors and start creating the funnel side of this, right? And what I want to point out is there are 94 connectors out of the box. And you'll recognize a lot of the players that you have in your environment. Think about some of the point solutions, the other cloud services. How about Amazon Web Services CloudTrail logs, right? Those are the activity logs on the AWS side. We should probably bring those in if we're working with both Azure and AWS, or we're working with AWS and we're an Office 365 customer. We might want to know, right, if there is an intrusion that occurs or a mailbox that is owned, and it turns out that that same user is also an admin over in AWS, well, we might want to know what deployments occurred right after that account was compromised, right? Again, this is the value of being able to work cross-vendor, cross-platform, cross-cloud, and bring all that signal into one place to do correlations again. So I call out AWS there. Hey, you got Apache HTTP servers, right? And you've got that log file being written. Let's bring that in. Are you a customer of Akamai? Let's talk about firewalls, right? If we look here and we look at Cisco, you guys, probably a lot of you are running Cisco gear, right? Are you a Checkpoint customer? Are you using Citrix web application firewall? Okay, a lot of you maybe have NetScalers out there, big IP F5s. Some of you are running big IPs on campus or virtual big IPs in the cloud. This is, Fortinet, right? All your major firewall vendors, Juniper, Palo Alto are in here as well. They're all in here, right? None of those are free. Those are all going to cause ingest meters to run. They are not part of the free stuff. I want you to know that they're here so you understand that if you choose to connect them and begin ingesting logs, you will run a meter. What we would suggest to you, if you're new to Sentinel, start with the free stuff. We think you're going to like what you see, and pretty quickly you're going to want to bring in more signal to help increase the value, the correlative value of what you're getting in Sentinel. And of course, at that point, you make an informed decision about, bringing in, log data and what that'll cost. And again, there's a pricing estimator, which I'll pop up here in a second to help you figure out what that'll cost. So one of the first things that—
Manuel,
yeah,
real quick, I just want to state one thing so nobody gets caught off guard or anything like that, because when you went over the slide on what was ingested for free, there was like Azure Activity Monitor. One thing that's not there is Azure Active Directory. So I just want to make it perfectly clear that if somebody's coming in here, they think they're going to connect into the free stuff and they click Azure Active Directory, that will incur an ingestion cost. So just to make sure everybody's clear on that, I just wanted to specifically point that out. Obviously, I think it's a really good thing to turn on, but as you said, as you're playing with the stuff, to initially try it out and see what it is, whether you like it, you want to go with the free stuff. As you start to look at, yes, that's Azure AD, sorry. That's one of the things that you want to make sure that you're not ingesting and thinking you're not going to be charged.
It's a great call out, Steve, because we have had customers get confused over that, right? And again, back over to the FAQ, right? If we read exactly what it says in the FAQ, it says Azure Activity Logs. It doesn't say Azure Active Directory. It says Azure Activity Logs, right? And that's what that is the management plane of Azure, right? So if you're making deltas to Azure deployments, that'll be in that activity log, and that's free to ingest, right? So Azure Active Directory, though, is one of the top paid ingest sources that the product team tells us they see customers deploying. So this is definitely a hot topic that might be first on your list for the paid ingest sources, but just as Steve pointed out, this one ain't free. This one is free to ingest, right?
Manuel?
Yes.
Is there a filter on here for free versus paid?
Yeah, I wish there was. It would be cool if there was like, a filter here, like in this drop down, say, hey, dude, show me the stuff that's free versus the stuff that's not. It's a good point of feedback. We deal with the product team a lot. This is the second time I've heard that. We'll take it back. Right now, there's not. It's a good call out. It'd be cool to see what's free, what's not, right here in the portal. The good thing though is it is documented, right? So if you know each one of those is documented. Like I said, I've got that in the slide deck for you. That could be your cheat code, right? To say, hey, you know, flip through these. If you flip through the slides, this is only the free stuff. That's all that's in this deck, right? This is all the free sources. And again, free with an asterisk, because some of these, to the point that we were talking about earlier, might require a specific M365 license on the end user for the signal to be generated. Otherwise, you'll have the connector up and that's great, but it'll get no signal in. Some of the connectors you can't enable if 0 users in that Azure AD tenant have the license assigned, right? So some of them do actually check and say, hey man, you can't enable this connector because you got nobody in this whole tenant that's got the ATP plan 2, for example. So we try to help you with that as well, so you don't set up a connector that's never going to hear any signal. So back over here, just to give you an idea of what this looks like. So here's Azure Activity. If I want to check out so you get a little brief on it, right? Here's a description. The Azure Activity Log is subscription log that provides insight into subscription level events that occur in Azure. Cool. That's the stuff being done, deployments in Azure and stuff. So how to go ahead and configure this? Well, it's pretty simple. To integrate with Azure Active Directory, make sure you've got read and write permissions on the workspace. Okay, cool. So if I configure the Azure Activity Logs, you can see here, I actually have a subscription called Manuel Microsoft Internal Consumption that is connected and is already sending logs. I have another one called Customer Velocity, another subscription that does not have the connector enabled. So I'll go ahead and connect that. And as simple as that, I now have both subscriptions bringing their activity logs into this Azure Sentinel workspace. And so the cool thing is in this summary, you can see this is how much data was received, how much signal was received each day. Obviously, this is my demo environment. I'm not hammering on this all the time, but you can see there are changes being made every single day, and those deltas are being brought in. So once you have a connector set up, you're like, okay, cool, I got data flowing in. Now what? Well, what's kind of cool is next to the basic instructions, you also have next steps. So next steps is kind of interesting because it points you to some workbooks for how to do stuff with the signal that came in. And so one of the, and by the way, also query examples in KQL language, as well as analytic templates that you can enable to actually find certain types of relevant threat tactic type events, right? So, and they're mapped to the MITRE ATT&CK framework. You can see that here. And if you want, you can create rules to go ahead and enable them. What I would do if I were you, the first time I'm looking at this is I'd look at the recommended workbooks and start there. Say, okay, there's this Azure Activity workbook. So the point here is you have a connector that Microsoft's giving you. There's 94 of them. Each of the connectors relates to one or more workbooks. The workbooks in turn use the data that the connector is feeding in. And so if we look at it and say, okay, let's select this workbook, and it's like, okay, cool, dude, it's got this kind of visual view. All right, let me take a look at the template or the, I've already saved one. That's why I have a saved workbook. But if I look at it, now I can go back and operate on that data that I've been bringing in. So for the last 7 days, I can see what are the activities graph over time, which are the resource groups that have API calls against them. And so, if I have outliers that look a little weird, I can do something about that. And these are all the caller identities and how many activities they're doing. And you can see, Steve, this is kind of interesting, right? This is me operating in my demo environment, and this is Big Brother. All of these are governance identities that Microsoft as a corporate entity imparts on our demo environments to make sure we're not doing stupid things. So it's kind of cool. I can see all the Big Brother activity going on here. So that's kind of neat. But again, you don't have sorry, I'm talking about this stuff because this is internal baseball. You guys as customers don't see this stuff. We see this because our subscriptions are nannied, so to speak, right? Because we're operating inside of Microsoft's corporate environment. So that's the Azure Activity Log, right? So if I come back over here, drop back into the connectors, I will see that I can now let's look at some other connectors here. I've got the next one I wanted to make sure I looked at was the Office, I think it's going to be Office 365, right? So if I come over here to Office 365, come all the way down to Office 365, because this is going to be a good source of data. You can see here that I've got the connector page I can open just like the other one. And it tells you, okay, man, in order to integrate with Office 365, make sure you, who's you, this person, this identity, has got workspace read and write permissions. Okay, I'm good for that. Tenant permission, global admin or security admin on the workspace's tenant. Well, the workspace's Azure AD tenant is Microsoft.com, and I do not have global administrator on Microsoft.com. So I can't connect this in the current connector config, but I have previously connected tenants, 2 of them. These are demo tenants that I've gotten. So I've actually got 2 different demo tenants that have their data flowing in, and that's how come I have data received coming in. So when you guys go to enable this for the first time, we've created the integration so that the user that's operating in the Azure portal needs to have global admin permissions on the workspace tenant. So to show you what that looks like, I'll pop over to Steve's demo environment, go to his data connector. And again, now I'm logging in as Manuel and Steve's demo domain. And if I come over here to Office 365, and open the connector page, I can see that I've got Exchange, SharePoint, and Teams data coming in from Steve's stschultz.com Azure AD domain. And so this user is a global admin. I do have this checkbox checked. So what I'm calling out to you guys is where we're talking about separation of duties. When you go to enable some of these connectors, the user that is operating inside Sentinel may need to have a role over in Azure AD that typically you don't have the same person having. Does that make sense? So like if you have good separation of duties, Steve is the global admin in Azure AD. I'm the Azure admin who monkeys around with things like Sentinel. And so when I go to enable this, I don't have global admin rights. So what I might need to do is have Steve become a contributor in my resource group or in my Sentinel Log Analytics workspace and let him log into the Azure portal, and then he can create this connection over to this data source, which is the Office 365 Activity Log. This is explained in the documentation, but I wanted to show you guys this just because it's one of the places where you can get tripped up, right? Because again, the user who is attempting to create this connection must have that privilege. And in this case, Steve has granted me an account that is both an Azure global admin in Azure AD and has the workspace read-write permissions in the Sentinel workspace. So I hope that didn't confuse things, but I just wanted to point out that this user has to be able to do those operations.
Manuel?
Yeah.
How does Azure connect to on-prem devices?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's a log forwarding agent in many of the cases, or there could be a direct agent on the VM depending on what the workload is. So we think about like there's a DNS for Microsoft's DNS service for Windows Server. That has an agent directly on the Windows Server that's running DNS, and it'll forward those out. That agent might require outbound HTTPS to public IP addresses in the Azure space, right? Another example.
The Cisco equipment and firewalls and such.
Right, that's the second example I was going to jump to. Great point, right? And so I've got this firewall. I can't drop an agent on the firewall. What are you talking about, man? So yeah, but generally what we'll do is you'll have a syslogd, right? So you can set up a Linux box. Some folks have that as a VM in Azure. There's a wizard where you can create a VM that's a syslog server, and then what you do is have that firewall forward the logs over to the syslogd. That syslog server will then ingest this into Sentinel. So remember when I said earlier, there's nothing that you need on premises for this, except sometimes you might need a forwarding agent. That's what I'm talking about. Does that make sense, Eugene?
Yes, sir, it does.
And then the by the way, the connector page. So let's go over to the connector page just so we can look at it together, right? Let's say Steve wanted to set up, let's use your example, Cisco. The cool thing is these connector scenarios are actually set up. They're not like generic. They're specific to what we're trying to connect. So if I open up the connector for a Cisco ASA, it'll tell me, hey, brother, these are the things you need to do. Make sure you have, again, what permissions do you need? And then we need a Linux syslog agent. Select or create a Linux machine. Do this, go get this package, forward the logs, set the configuration, go, right? So it gives you instructions for what to do to set up the forwarding. So to your point, Eugene, when you talk about some of the appliance scenarios, like a firewall, like I don't know, like a WAF or any of the other appliances that are out there that tend to be fixed in nature, it's usually a syslog scenario. Also, Sentinel, obviously operates with a common event framework. So there's obviously connectors for so many of the different providers out there, but there's also a common event framework ingest. So anything that uses CEF, we can bring in as well, right? So obviously, the major vendors, the major players, right? We have connectors for those that will be, as full fidelity as possible with every field, pre-mapped, et cetera. And then of course you have the common event format for anything else that follows CEF, which is pretty industry dominant. Excellent. So that's a couple of examples. We can look at some of the other scenarios. Let's see. It looks like Steve. It looks like you set up DNS. That was one of the ones I was talking about. I'm looking at Steve's environment because he's got 15 connected data sources, right? And so we look at some of the other things that are in the Defender suite. So M365 Defender. Steve has got that connected. We look at the connector.
And that's one
page.
of the things that you can actually filter on up top. You can say filter on what's just your connections.
Yes, exactly. Yep. And then, and of course, here you can also say, okay, what logs do we want to bring over into Sentinel, right? And so, in this case, you might want to bring all the signal in. Again, this M365 Defender signal is not charged, and so you can bring in additional things that are coming soon once they're baked. One thing to call out when we think about preview, I don't want to insert my biases here, but we're talking about collecting logs, essentially, right? Collecting activity logs. To me, I look at the word preview here and I go, okay, it's not GA yet, but what's the potential damage to my production environment by ingesting logs? Hopefully it's pretty low, particularly when we're thinking about something like Microsoft 365 Defender, because you're already licensing and purchasing a cloud-based security suite, which you're now just asking to forward logs into Sentinel. So what I would tell you guys is, I caution customers against deploying production services in Azure preview services. Like, if there's a brand new web server, web app, right, that's in preview, hey, be cautious deploying that in production because you've got a website that needs to be up. In this case, we're talking about ingesting logs, right? And so what I would encourage you to do is, if you're super cautious and super conservative, well, fine, stay away from the preview connectors. But what I would tell you is we're talking about log ingest here. I think your risk level should be pretty low across the board. Now, I wouldn't be afraid of the preview connectors just because it's so cool to get that telemetry in and then be able to make some decisions against that. Of course, what you may want to be cautious about is, for example, automating a security response to signal that's coming in from a preview connector, just in case, I don't know, maybe there's a data mismatch or something and you wind up disabling somebody's account when you shouldn't have. Right there, you might want to use some caution. But just ingesting it and looking at the results and looking at the alerts, I think, in my humble opinion, that should be a safe activity. So I think, Steve, is there anything else that we should make sure that we cover here as we talk about the ingest?
So before you click away from that, one of the things I want to point out just on the the next steps on this one here, up top, you'll actually see that we've actually created workbooks for things like SolarWinds. So, post-compromise hunting, so you can actually hunt in your organization for things like that. So it's really, really powerful tool. You also seen that there was something in there for the cyber maturity model certification. So if you happen to be in the GCC or GCC high space rather, and you want to, and you're getting ready to go for that CMFC, we are putting those types of templates inside of our products as well.
Yeah, it's pretty powerful, and it's just these workbooks. The idea here is it'll give you a starting point, right? An idea, and of course the workbooks are editable, customizable, and the queries can be looked at, right? So obviously there's a ton of reference material here too, but just really cool to have these as starting points, right? We think about those of you that have gone through the journey with the traditional SIM solution, right? Just think about how long it takes to get to real productivity, so to speak. We're trying to close that timeline, right? By giving you these workbooks, by giving you these starter kits that you can go ahead and then expand across. And by the way, it should call out, it's powerful also in the third-party scenarios, right? So there are workbooks for, the third-party Junipers, the Palo Altos, et cetera. You'll get multiple workbooks that are tuned for the signal coming from that appliance by the way, also cross-referenced with other signals coming from, for example, the rest of the M365 suite, right, or Defender suite. So it really is, I think, super, super powerful to start off with what's free. You know, Azure AD Activity Log is one of the common pay for log ingest items that customers add. Domain controller activity logs is another one that customers tend to add. That one's pretty chatty, so you got to watch how many security events you're bringing in. And then their firewall. That's the next thing that a lot of customers do is they'll bring in the firewall data. I would tell you guys just a brief story from a K-12 back when Sentinel was in public preview. This K-12 connected some of the free data ingest sources, and they connected their Cisco. And after about a month of running Sentinel, this guy sent me an email and said, man, just like what happened to Target, we had compromised HVAC devices that were moving, causing lateral attacks on our network. Cisco had identified it, and it was throwing alerts in our Cisco firewall management solution, but none of us humans had the bandwidth to see it and react to it, and it was in for months. And only when we brought all that signal into Sentinel, including the Cisco data, did it finally get to a point where a human being saw it with their eyeballs, and we were able to react to that. But this was in for months. And so this is nothing heroic Sentinel did other than the wheat from chaff stuff, right? Sentinel did not find that, Cisco did. But Sentinel provided a one-stop shop that the humans happened to be looking at because they were looking at a lot of signal that elevated that signal to the point where a human finally saw it, because it was crammed in along with too much other data for humans to react to it for months in that Cisco world. And again, it's not an indictment of Cisco's products at all. What it is just human nature. We're just overwhelmed. So I think to me that was a big, powerful one from very, very early days. And again, a K-12, under-resourced, overburdened.
All right, so we do have a few questions. So I'll read some of them off to you there. Mark wrote, it'd be great to be able to set limits on ingestion to prevent surprise bills. I don't know if we can do that. I don't know if you'd really want to do that, just because, if you hit your upper limit and then you're basically handicapping your security based on your ingestion, but I understand why they would ask for something like that. Is that possible to do?
So in the underlying log analytics, there is an option for setting. So if I go to my workspace settings, I believe I can set up limits on the logs. So usage and estimated costs here on the logs, and then I can do a daily cap, and I can set a cap. The problem when you start playing with this is now you're going to have gaps in your logs. Mm-hmm. And you have to be very, very cautious because, as I was talking about from the beginning of the whole conversation, checking those boxes on compliance. If you're checking the boxes, probably assumed is that you don't have gaps in your logs. And so that's the one danger of, like Steve was calling out, is you can set caps on some of these ingests. You can do that, but just be cautious, because if you exceed the gap, if you exceed the cap, you will have gaps.
Yep. There's another question, and I don't know if you've answered this one already. Are there log sources for Azure joined or hybrid joined devices looking to replace Windows Event Collector servers?
Okay, so I'm thinking. Okay, so there's a couple different approaches, right? One is give me all the raw data. The other one is let me have some kind of a product or solution stand in between and just give me the refined data. And that's where I'm wondering, Steve, just thinking big picture, if you own some of the M365 Defender security products, maybe what you do is you apply those products to those endpoints, and then you say, hey, I know those products are going to give me refined signal, and I will ingest that signal into Sentinel, rather than trying to pursue the events in the event log.
John writes, is there a log analytic for each subscription?
Great question. So this is where we have to think about like the organizational aspects of Azure. So you have an Azure subscription, right? And inside of a subscription can live a log analytics and Sentinel workspace, right? What can they collect? Well, as you saw when I was setting up the connectors, for example, for the Azure Activity Log, I have a single Azure Sentinel workspace and a single Log Analytics workspace that are collecting Azure Activity Logs from multiple Azure subscriptions, right? So I can do many to one. So, John, I'm not sure how to answer the question, but I guess what I would say is you can have dozens or hundreds of Azure subscriptions feeding something like the specifically Azure Activity Log into a single Log Analytics workspace. Also, you can have multiple firewalls, right? You can have multiple Office 365 tenants, et cetera, feeding into a single, hold on, I misspoke there. Office 365 tenants, maybe a little more complicated because the Office 365 ingest source does have to be the same Azure AD tenant, but you could have multiple, no, yeah, that's one-to-one. That's one case where it's one-to-one. Other than that, I think it's pretty much many-to-one.
All right.
So, sorry, so I know that was confusing, but John, I just want to try to make sure I'm catching the angle. If you do have two Azure AD tenants, right, which is sometimes an EDU, maybe students are in one and staff are in another. If you wanted
Medical.
to ingest that, you'd be looking at, or medical, yeah, you'd be looking at potentially 2 Log Analytics workspaces today. But if you're in that situation, let us know. Send me. I'll put my email address here. Send me a note. And tell me if you're in that situation, and we can try to figure out a workaround.
The next question is: picking LA region is important when it comes to on-prem ingest sources, correct?
Yeah, important to a degree. I mean, what are we concerned about, right? It's ingest into the cloud, so it's not like you get billed for it. And yeah, there might be a latency difference if you're sitting in New York between Azure East and Azure West, but we're talking about logs, right? So, you know, to me, really what it matters is I would tend to set it up where I have other facilities I might leverage, right? So where I have my existing Log Analytics workspace, wherever I had set that up, right? So it tends to be in the region where you planted your home flag, right? Your primary region when you started building out, where you might have hybrid networking connected to. One of the other reasons that may be helpful is in your home, let's think about hub and spoke scenario, where you have an express route or a VPN connection terminating for private networking. Think about the Log Analytics scenario we just talked about. If you have a Cisco firewall, you can deploy a Linux virtual machine on premises that's got a log forwarding agent that sends it to the cloud, or if you wanted to, depending on your, what you find acceptable from a firewalling perspective, you could have click the easy button and say, give me a Linux virtual machine in Azure that already has log forwarding agent. Let me configure that real quick, and then I'll have my Cisco send the logs over the private network through that express route or VPN circuit into that VM, which then will forward it to Sentinel, right? You know, apples and oranges, whichever one you prefer. But my point is, being in the region, deploying in the region that's close to where you have your networking base may make sense.
And for those that are cost conscientious, some data centers actually cost more than others, correct?
Yeah, there can be variations. I'm not up to date on the Log Analytics and Sentinel pricing variations region to region. But there can be variations, and that can be a driving consideration, particularly when you get into many terabytes of logs. Yep.
Michael Hart writes, is there a storage cost for ingested data?
So it depends on the connector that's used, right? So that's what we were talking about at the top of the call, right? So if we come back over here, not that I'm going to kill you with PowerPoint, but we'll come back to the free connectors, which again, these are all the free connectors that are in the deck, right? It's these. So if you're bringing in these log sources don't cost money. If you're bringing
but that's
in
for 90 days.
Correct, for 90 days. I'm sorry, what was the question? Was it beyond 90 days?
Well, no, it just said, is there a storage cost for
Yeah.
ingested data? So if they want it for longer than 90 days, then they will start incurring a cost for that.
Very good point, Steve. Thanks for the reminder. Absolutely. 90 days is the default. That is free. If you want to retain longer than 90 days, you will start to pay the standard Log Analytics and Azure Sentinel retention and ingest cost. By the way, there's also a solution. Oh, forgive me. Forgive me. It's not in this deck. I will try to add it, Steve, if we can before we publish this. There is a solution for taking longer term retention data, scraping it out of Log Analytics and Sentinel, and sending it into a data lake, and then doing even KQL queries against it. So you can continue to use your KQL queries, but do it against a data lake to drive costs down. That's fairly recently emerging. But for those of you, again, I think this is something that you get into when you're talking about, a large institution with large amounts of data ingest and lengthy retention requirements. That may be a solution that may make sense. I don't have that handy, I think, right now, but we've talked about it on Azure Hour, and we can potentially dig into that. We've got a couple customers that are doing that. It might be, Steve, a good idea for another
Sure.
talk down the road would be, hey, how can we do, I guess, the most efficient and cheapest way to retain data long-term and still have a lot of the functionality on querying
Right.
when we talk about extending Sentinel with that solution.
Perfect. There seems to be one more question here. Can Sentinel or Log Analytics collect more event logs than just security app system, like Microsoft Windows DHCP server, operational, or something?
Yeah, so you can bring in anything common event framework type, kind of data, and then there are connectors for some things that are kind of related to that. So if we look at, I think you have this enabled, Steve. If I go back over to your Sentinel workspace and I look at your connectors, I think Steve's got DNS enabled. I think I do as well.
Yes, I did. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is one that kind of hits close to that, right? So DNS, right? So this is Microsoft's integrated DNS on Windows servers, right? So this would be kind of close to that. I don't see DHCP here. So, that's not something that we're offering today. But I guess that what I would say is, common event framework, you could.
And the DNS one was actually put in there after SolarWinds, because that was one of the portions of the SolarWinds attack, was to actually make it start hijacking DNS. And we were asked questions about, hey, how can we protect our servers from making rogue DNS requests and making sure they're not going to malicious sites and stuff like that. And that's one of the pieces that was put in there from a Sentinel perspective.
And so I'd say, chipping away at some of the things that you might want to pull out of an event log, right? So here's Windows Firewall, right? So if you're running Windows Firewall on your Windows servers or clients, right, you could bring in the relevant log data from Windows Firewall without having to go scoop into the event logs, right? By enabling this connector. But there's not a Windows event log connector. Obviously, there's raw syslog. So if you think about Windows events, there's plenty of solutions that will let you forward event logs to syslog, and then you can ingest it in here, right? You could do that. But there's not to your point, there's not a Windows event log connector that I'm aware of.
All right, well, we've got about 6 minutes left. That was the last question. If there's any other questions, please come off mute, ask them. I'm actually going to stop the recording at this point. If I can figure out where I'm at here, too many things going on. Here we go. And the